Hello, all you magical moose out there. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about conservation, nature, and sustainability. My name is Casey. I am one of your hosts, and I am with the magical Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Oh,
Hi.
hi. I don't know about me, but moose are definitely magical
So
and
cool.
terrifying. But
If you've listened to past episodes, you know that I'm so stoked. And Sarah's slightly terrified of the subject matter. So we are getting into some fun stuff. Welcome to another episode. We are trying to get a little bit back in the groove, Sarah. So last episode we talked about some shenanigans happening in the Florida state parks.
we
Yeah.
did, yes.
Um,
And
Go for it.
well, I was just going to say, you had some really good tie-ins about how we can all sort of get together and find our causes, find our people, and use our voices a little more effectively to make things about the environment that we care about known to the people who are representing us. So it was a good one. Definitely check it out if you haven't listened to that one yet.
Yeah, and if you've found your people, share who those people are so other people might be able to join your people.
Yeah. And I did actually, this is going to be a really bad story because I actually cannot remember specifically what it was for, but I did submit an email to my representative through the Nature Conservancy.
Oh,
I
good.
literally cannot remember at this moment. I was just telling Casey before we started recording about the sort of crazy week that it's been. So this, like I said, is a really bad story, but I did. It was very easy. Again, this Nature
Yeah.
Conservancy is an organization that I follow. I'll get emails every once in a while about different things, different causes, different legislation that they're looking at, and encouraging folks to speak out one way or another. And they make it super easy to contact your representative. So I did that this past week.
Excellent. Love that. It's time to take action about things that you care about. It's always time, but it's an extra good time right now.
All right. All right. Shall we just jump in, Casey,
Let's jump in.
and talk about
Yes.
moose? Casey, when you think of moose, I feel like this is like an interpretation activity that
It
we're
is.
starting
Yes.
now. But when I say moose, give me three words that come to mind, whether that's descriptive or just feelings. Three words.
Oh, I'm having flashbacks. The first is big because
Okay.
these are very, very large animals, especially compared to white-tailed deer, which we've done an episode on recently. So these are really big comparatively. Um, I would say the north
Okay.
because they're cold weather.
Yep.
They're mostly exclusively north. And the next one is it's kind of more of a feeling, but maybe if there was a word for the type of wild places that are almost like lonely, like I'm always a picture a moose in boreal forest sort of landscape, but the moose is generally alone in my envisionings of it, and it's in a really large, like, backed by mountains or in a really large forest, and so that is like the vibe I'm looking for. Maybe it's solitude, maybe it's
I was
the
gonna say
wild.
isolated, but
Yeah, maybe that's it.
okay, that was like a lot more than three words, but
Sorry, I said if there
perfect.
was a word, that
Yeah,
was.
got it. That was good. Casey's basically just told us everything we need to know about moose. So
Okay, episode
great.
over.
Good night. No.
Cool.
So my three words are fear is like that
Yeah,
is just there's like a immediate pit in my stomach when I hear
that's so interesting.
yeah, but also I think awe comes alongside of that. I
Yeah.
think that I have to give both of those two words, even though the immediate is fear, especially now that I have seen one in the wild and my
Yeah.
response was so crying, like and sort of this just amazement. I think that it is fear, but it's because I'm in awe of
Yeah.
them. And then I'm gonna go with awkward as
Okay,
my
yeah,
third
that's
one
not
because
wrong.
when we talk about them, I think that it'll make sense. I can be simultaneously like awed by the majesty of a moose, but also like you're a little bit
If
ridiculous
you look at
too
them
at the same
too
time.
closely, you're like, why does your leg move that way? Like that kind
Yes.
of. of way.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I want to say like my isolation sort of feeling is more like a contentment in isolation. Like it's not a
No,
lonely sort of way.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
I do. Yes, as hardcore introvert, I think that I do understand exactly what you're getting at. No, I was just teasing you about the amount of words, but I
Too many.
do actually sort of feel that vibe that you were trying to go with. I don't necessarily have a good word for you either, but I know what you're trying to say. So, well done. Y'all, we're going to talk about moose when we come back, so stick around. All right. Thanks for joining us for another episode, everyone. If you've been listening for a little while, you know that this episode it's been in mind for, I guess, probably a couple months now and stemmed from, for me, originally from a trip that I took last summer, my first time going out to Rocky Mountain National Park. I got to see a moose in the wild for the first time. It was amazing. Casey did a fantastic episode on white-tailed deer as well. And then through doing that episode, it just sort of came to the surface that maybe we also needed to do a full episode on moose. So here we are. And I will say that this episode maybe didn't end up being exactly what I thought it was going to be, in that I sort of had in mind one angle when I started, and then another, perhaps more pertinent thing kind of rose to the top. So we'll see if we get both things in or not. We'll talk about it as we go along. But Casey, let's start with an overview of moose. And I think our three words kind of gave a good brief overview. You mentioned the north, and that is where moose are found. They're found in northern, kind of temperate and subarctic forests around the world. So they're found in North America, Europe, and Asia. And apparently, because we like to be confusing, in other parts of the world, they are also referred to as elk.
No. No.
Which
I strike it down. No, thank you.
Casey refuses. Sorry, Casey.
Caribou and reindeer's already confusing
I know
enough.
that is
What is with
actually
the
very
deer?
confusing. Yes. So, yes, this is different than what we call elk here in the United States. Moose are a separate thing, but apparently they can be called European elk or Eurasian elk, I think, as well. So, just depending on where you're listening from, just know
Just Google a moose, and if it looks like an
it's,
elk to you, you
I
know what
think
we're talking about.
Alcis alcis is the scientific name. I think it's
Okay.
ALCES for both the genus and the species name. That's what we're talking about today. And this is a pretty, I was going to say popular, but I guess well populated species. It's listed as a species of least concern by the IUCN, and the population trend overall for moose is increasing. We'll get down to a little more local populations here as we go along, but overall, that's the status. Canada has the largest population of moose by country. Casey, in the United States, Alaska has the biggest moose population. I'm just curious, do you happen to know which US state outside of Alaska, so after Alaska, which one's next?
Is it Maine?
It is!
Yeah.
Okay, so this was
I
just a me
love moose.
thing. Well, okay, so you maybe have a better moose baseline than I did, but first I that sort of took me by surprise. I lost the list that I initially pulled that from, but I think every other state was a state more out west, which is just what
Yeah.
my brain naturally is. I would think Alaska first, but then I just think those kind of north and west, and I sort of forget about New England also having a good population of moose. So well done.
Well, I should say, Sarah, were you at our old job when we had our moose scientist visit
No, you mentioned
who made
this
me
in the
love
white-tailed deer
mooses?
episode, I think, but no,
Yes.
I
So we
missed
had
yours.
I Googled him to make sure that I was remembering things correctly, and his
Hmm.
name is Dr. Seth Moore, and he came and was a guest speaker, and he works in Minnesota. And so during a bunch of he does the most fascinating research on moose, I tell you guys. So cool. But he was talking about how populations of moose in Maine were healthier than populations of moose in Minnesota, due to, I'm sure, some factors that we'll get into.
Yeah, excellent. Oh, I can't wait. Yeah, throw please whatever you comes to mind as we're talking from your knowledge base there. Please throw it in there. So let's talk a little bit about moose and where they fall. We talked about white-tailed deer. Moose are also cervids. They're in the deer family. Casey, do you care to throw out some of the sort of similar traits or characteristics that moose are going to have that we've talked about before?
So they're artiodactyls, so they're even-toed. So they've got the
Yeah.
two-toed
Yeah.
ungulates,
Two-toed
probably.
hooves. Yeah.
Yeah, two-toed hooves. So like a deer. And the major thing about deer as a family is that for most species, they have antlers. So like a bony growth that comes out of their head that then falls off. They shed at some point in the year and then they regrow. And
Yeah.
in a lot of these species, it's mostly a male trait. Although there's some species that don't. And these are different than horns because horns don't shed year after year.
Right.
Antlers are special and they're super cool.
Yeah. It is pretty impressive. I know we talked about some of this in the white-tailed deer episode too, and I don't want to necessarily repeat everything, but
Yeah.
it's been a few weeks since we did that, and perhaps not everyone's listened, so we might touch on a few of the same things too. But yeah, the just the growth rate for antlers, how fast they can grow is pretty crazy. But yeah, those are some of the general characteristics of deer, and moose are like most deer in that it's the males that are going to grow those antlers. There are some exceptions where females will grow too in certain species, and very, very occasionally you might see a female moose that gets small little nubs there. But generally speaking, it is going to be the males that grow those antlers. Also, there are some other little traits, like deer tend to lack the upper incisors, so they don't have any teeth on the top of their mouths in the front of their mouths. So that's another common deer trait. And then, as like many other deer, moose are classified as browsers, which means that they eat primarily woody and herbaceous plants as opposed to other types of animals called grazers, which that's think of like your cows that are going to feed primarily on grasses. So grazers, grasses, browsers, those woody and herbaceous plants. Their diet does vary a little bit seasonally too. They're going to be tending to eat more of the woody plants, twigs, branches, things like that in the wintertime. In the summertime, they're going to be finding more of the leaves of the plants. They're going to be spending a lot of time in and around the water, eating some aquatic plants and things like that as well. The diet choices in terms of being like browsers and grazers too also correspond to some small differences in their digestive systems, which is really interesting if you get down into it. It's things like the size of the salivary glands, shape and size of the teeth, different lengths of different parts of the digestive tract, and all of that between those browsers and grazers, which is very interesting. Also, related to diet, maybe my favorite thing that I learned about moose and for this whole episode was what the word moose means. Was that something that you were familiar with, Casey?
I'm not, but I will say that when I told Andrew we were doing the subject, he said, ask Sarah why it's not meese. It's for plural of moose, but I figured it out based on what you're telling me. So tell me the origin for me.
Okay, well, I also have a comment to add on to
Okay.
that at the end. But yes, so the origin of the word, and I got this from the Unamagi Institute of Natural Resources. The word moose comes from an Algonquin word. I don't even want to try to say it. It's Mooswa, meaning twig eater or the animal that strips bark off of trees. And I just find that thoroughly delightful because of all of the ways, as we started off with in the beginning, that you could describe a moose or the
Yeah.
feelings that moose imparts. We call this gigantic, amazing, huge animal the twig eater, which is also very appropriate and totally
Yeah.
fits from their behavior. But I find the English translation to be thoroughly delightful.
Yeah, you're right. That's so interesting that that's like their
I love
identifier
it. I
for
love it.
them. So interesting, different perspective of like, historically how they're viewing this animal.
Yeah.
If you're wondering why it's not meese, it's because moose has a different language origin
Yeah.
than goose, and goose is more from like the Dutch Germanic tradition. And so there's different plurals for that. So now I have an answer for Andrew
There
because you
you
gave
go.
me the origin of the word moose.
I'm so glad that we could do that. I also have to say that and this is going to be showing my age again, but when I was a kid, Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen,
Hmm.
the Olsen twins from Full House. They
Of course.
they were like all of the
Everywhere.
rage
Hmm.
for a period of time. I was already, I think, a little too old, but they did these like this sing-along songs tape
Hmm.
thing, and one of the songs was something about this type of singular and plural of animals, and had a line in it that a moose is two meese. And so that's what I always think of
You
in my
always think of
head
bees.
is, yeah, I hear this specific like notes of the song going along with a moose is two meese. So there you go.
Yeah,
But it's not.
it's not. It's mooses
Is
or
it
moose.
actually mooses? I say
I don't know.
moose. I say moose for singular and plural.
Okay,
That's
now
what
I'm
you're
gonna have to
getting
look
from
it up.
me. Okay. Well, we've already taken a tangent that I didn't
It's
intend
moose. You're
tonight.
correct. I am
Okay.
wrong.
Excellent.
Some people mistakenly use mooses according to Google AI. I am some people.
All right, excellent. Well, let's talk about moose behavior. Again, pretty similar to some of the things that we discussed with white-tailed deer in terms of their sort of seasonality, their reproduction, and that sort of thing, although they do have a slower reproductive rate than white-tailed deer, which comes into play later on too. So I think we talked about with white-tailed deer how typically they'll breed before they're two, but sometimes even before they're one, correct?
Yeah, as young as 7 months.
Yeah, which is
Crazy.
crazy. But a female moose, which is called a cow, will typically breed at about 28 months, so a little over 2 years, although breeding has been known to occur as early as 16 months. They have a gestation period of about a little less than 8 months, about 230 days, and they'll typically give birth to their calves in the spring. Babies weigh about 28 pounds, which I can't decide if that feels big or small to me in terms of a moose. But either way, what is crazy is that in the first 5 months, they can grow to be about 10 times that size.
Wow. I'm
Yeah,
gonna go with it seems small because like my
because of
baby
how
was 1/4 the size of that, but I am well under 1/4 the size of a moose.
true. Good point. Calves will generally be weaned in the fall, and then mom will kind of kick them out before they give birth to their next calf in the spring. I didn't put it on in this part, I guess, as well, but we also talked about Casey. I was a little bit surprised by how high the rate of twins. Twins is normal for white-tailed deer,
Hmm.
correct? For moose, not so much. One tends to be more the norm, but they can also have twins, especially if they're in good health, good food, all that sort of thing. But one tends to be a little bit more of the norm.
That was something that Dr. Seth talked about is that twins ended up being more common in the studies he's done than previously thought because they were surveying the populations later in the season. And
Got
so they
it.
have like a higher mortality rate of like one of the calves not making it. So they
Hmm.
assumed that most moose, I mean, still most moose probably give birth to one calf, but twins are way more common.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I should say most. I can't remember. There's a chart somewhere. Hopefully I can find that. It'll be one of the links in the show notes too, that sort of graphs reproductive rate normal and kind of stressed with one of the things
Oh,
that
yeah,
we're going to
yeah.
talk about later. And so it does tend to show that for a period it is pretty common for them to have twins as well, but not as common as white-tailed deer. They do tend to be fairly solitary outside of the cow-calf pairs, but they will occasionally form groups. Sometimes you'll see groups of bull moose, and then especially in winter times, if the snow conditions and food conditions are favorable for it, you'll see them in groups. And they're not particularly territorial. So even if they're not wandering around together, they don't necessarily have particular territories. Okay, so what makes moose so cool? What makes them stand out? What makes them unique? Moose are the largest of the deer family and the second largest land animal that we have here in the United States. So they are pretty impressive. Adults can range anywhere from 800 pounds, that would be smaller cow, and then up to like 1,600 pounds for your big bull moose. They can stand over 6 feet tall, 9 feet long. They have these crazy heads. Like their heads,
Yeah.
I think of white-tailed deer as being sort of delicate and graceful, and moose are just the opposite of that. They have these long, sort of boxy, I would say, heads and long, kind of like long noses.
I think if you've
Um,
watched Rocky and Bullwinkle, maybe
yeah,
that's a really old reference, but like I feel like that's fairly like the
I don't
gesture.
know.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't know. But yes, they're big. They have big heads. They have antlers that are a little bit different. They have more palmate antlers, so sort of wider, flattened than what you might imagine from a white-tailed deer. These antlers can get to over a 6 foot span and weigh over 60 pounds. Like, can you imagine? I have to carry bags that are around 50 pounds day to day in my work. I just can't imagine walking around with that growing out of the top of your head.
You have to really strong neck muscles for that.
Yeah. And they do, I mean, I imagine that this is related. Moose have the kind of humped back. They have those sort of
Hmm.
shoulders that stick up as well. So that's another kind of distinguishing characteristic. They also have a dewlap, also sometimes referred to as a bell. So this sort of flap that hangs down from their neck. And just another thing that I love coming across when I'm learning about animals is this is a we don't really know. We don't know why they have it. It probably has some kind of use in mating, similar to the way that large antlers are a sign of a good, healthy male. That probably this is another indicator for females when mating. Maybe it has something to do with thermoregulation. But it's nice knowing that there's still a lot of things that we have left to learn out there, including what exactly the purpose of a moose dewlap is. So let's talk about, now that we kind of know, hopefully have this picture of moose in our heads, let's talk about what they do. So, Casey, when we're thinking about large herbivores like moose, what role would you say they have in the environment? What do they do in the ecosystem?
So moose are obviously herbivores, and when you're large like that, you're going to need a lot of calories to sustain that mass. So they're going to be eating a lot of plants, which is going to impact plant communities
Hmm.
within an area. So we talked about with white-tailed deer, the presence of deer can impact the growth of the forest. I'm sure moose have that same sort of impact where they're influencing what plants can grow at what rate in areas.
Yeah, that's a huge one for sure. And we'll talk about that too as we get to the issues facing populations and regulating populations.
They're also being herbivores, prey for other animals. Although I'm not sh like I assume that there's only a couple predators for moose, really.
Yeah. And it's typically the calves, something like
Oh yeah, yeah.
wolves or
Hmm.
bears would be their primary natural predators outside of people.
Yeah. So they provide some sort of prey animal. I mean, and then if they're scavengers too, I'm sure that's a pretty good haul for a
Yeah,
vulture or a coyote or something like that as well.
absolutely.
Which kind of plays into the whole like taking nutrients from one part of the ecosystem to another, being that
Right.
large and doing it more efficiently than like a lot of little animals at a time doing it. So I know that a predator per se, a parasite is something that we'll be talking about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of parasites for moose too. So that's a part of the ecosystem we don't normally talk about and we don't really love because parasites have that ick factor because humans can have parasites um and
It just
just
has a
the
negative connotation to the
well,
word too.
absolutely. Yeah, like the idea of passively or actively sucking the life out of something is just or feeding on them does has an ick factor for us for sure. But moose are definitely a source of nutrients for a lot of parasites.
Yeah.
And they can also be vectors for them because they can move them from one area to another.
Yeah. Yeah, so all those things are true. I also read about moose being considered indicator species in some areas, just in part because of the large
Yeah.
amount of resources that they have to consume. That if you are able to support moose in the population, then you've probably got some good habitat going on there. So we mentioned up top that overall, as a species, this is a species of least concern with an increasing population, but the state of moose populations does certainly vary by location, especially, and I primarily just researched here in the United States, so apologies if you're listening from other places around the world where you have moose. Definitely look into what's going on in your area, but you could kind of go state by state here, and different state websites will talk about the status of their population. In areas where they're talking about decline, the cause is often linked to habitat loss, whether that's agriculture or other, or parasites, which is the big one that we are going to be talking about this evening. And those parasites are becoming an increasing problem due to climate change. So, first, I want to touch on real quick. We did talk about this as well in our white-tailed deer episode, but brainworm is the first parasite that I want to mention. Casey, do you remember? I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do you remember at all what we talked about from white-tailed deer?
Oh yeah, I will never forget brainworms once you
Give
learn
us
about
a
them.
give us a quick synopsis.
So they are worms that live in the brain of deer, and part of their reproductive cycle is that they'll shed to other parts of the body, and the deer will poop them out, eaten by snails. The snails then climb up onto the vegetation, which is then eaten by another deer, and that is how the brainworm spreads. Sarah, I don't know how in depth that you're going to go into
No,
about brainworms and moose, but I Dr. Seth had a lot to say, and I will never
oh,
forget it.
do you want to go for it? I was not.
Yeah.
I was just going to sort of
Oh,
transiently mention. So in white-tailed deer,
yes.
they white-tailed deer are carriers, so they are
Hmm.
rarely affected by this parasite, but
Yeah,
they
they just
spread
passively,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, they will help to spread the parasite, and moose are not so lucky when it comes to brainworm. So they eat the quote unquote infected material off of the plants and go forth, Casey.
Yeah, so these white-tailed deer populations are venturing more and more north because of climate change. They're
Hmm.
overlapping with moose populations, and so even though the brainworm maybe, for lack of a better word, intends for another white-tailed deer to eat the snail, the moose eats it, and the brainworm says, "Cool, I'm inside a cervid," and then it goes up into the brain and says, "Where is my white-tailed deer brain?" And it basically eats around in it there, causing brain damage in these moose. So Dr. Seth talked about how they found a moose in the middle of Lake Michigan, just like swimming in circles
Yeah,
because it just had brain damage from brainworms. And so it causes them just not to be able to function and obviously
yeah,
reduces their fitness and eventually they die.
yeah. It actually is horrible.
It
It's
is.
horrible to think about. I just life as a wild animal is very tough.
Yeah.
It is very, very tough. And this is we're here, laughing about it a little bit just because it's a funny thing. It's a weird thing to talk about, but it is horrible. It
Yeah.
leaves these poor moose in a terrible condition. I think they lose their eyesight. They can just all sorts of terrible things that can come from this. And yes, I think Casey, as you mentioned, the thing to note about this is happening more because of climate change. Climate change is allowing moose and white-tailed deer do not tend to overlap habitat that much. Moose are adapted for cold weather. They have those long legs to walk through snow. They have this thick protective hair coat that helps to keep them warm in those cold winters. White-tailed deer, they're not about that life, but these warmer winters are allowing them to overlap more and more, which leads to the spread of this parasite. So that's one. The second one that I don't think talked about last time that I wanted to focus on this time with the moose is another parasite called the winter tick. And I think of ticks as being disease vectors primarily, but that's actually not the issue with this tick. The issue is not that it's spreading a disease. The issue is simply the quantity and the blood that they drain. Casey, remember when we talked about mosquitoes and you hated the word blood meal so
I
much?
hated it
Yeah,
so much.
I read that word a lot about winter ticks, but I'll try not to say it again after that. Um,
When
but
we're talking about these ticks on these moose, we're talking about thousands, if not like,
thousands.
yeah,
Yeah,
thousands of ticks on a single moose.
tens of
Tens of
thousands of
thousands. I
ticks.
didn't want to overestimate, but yeah,
Yeah, no,
like
I've seen anywhere from 40,000 to 90,000 ticks that have been found on a single animal. So, this is another thing that is directly related to climate change. This populations of this parasite has increased because of warmer winters. That's why this is happening. So these ticks get on the moose. The moose suffer from anemia. They'll suffer from hair loss if they're trying to get these things off of them, which can lead them with poor protection. And basically, these ticks, they stay on one host for their entire adult life cycle. And this is also a thing that I wasn't familiar with before, and I will have to research other types of ticks. But so ticks will basically climb up to like the top of a plant and they'll do this questing behavior where they're like seeking out a source to come by that they can grab onto. And these winter ticks apparently have interlocking limbs. So if one tick attaches, they can take that's how they get these high rates of
what?
infestation, basically, is because they're interlocking limbs with all their little sibling ticks.
They like
And
barrel a
they just
monkeys it up onto
apparently, that's
the.
what I'm imagining. Yeah, this was not a thing. I took parasitology classes many years ago, and I don't remember anything like that. Um, yeah, that is what happens with this. So, as you can imagine, being infested with thousands of ticks that are draining your blood is going to affect your ability to survive and live comfortably. So, what does all that mean for the moose? I've got a couple of studies here, the results of a couple of studies. So, there was a study published in the Canadian Journal of Zoology in 2018 that found that from 2014 to 2016, 70% of moose calves in west central Maine and northern New Hampshire died of emaciation by winter tick infestation. On average, each animal hosted 47,371 ticks
On a calf.
on a calf. Yeah, they're the ones that are the most susceptible.
Sure.
Adults will tend to survive, but their
Reduced fitness.
reproduction, yeah, reduced
Yeah.
fitness, their reproduction rate is going to drop way down. So there's another study done by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department during the 2017 to 2019 is where they were looking at. It was a relatively, I guess, small population. They looked at 36 adult cows and 90 calves that were around 8 months old. And so they did GPS collars to kind of monitor and track. And so, from the results of their study, they found that 87% of adults survived each year, but only 57% of those cows gave birth, which was a decline of around 50% compared to birth rates in the early 2000s. Only 66% of newborn calves survived their first 60 days. Only 49% of calves 8 to 12 months old survived their first winter. And their conclusion from this study was that without the ticks, over 90% of those calves would have survived. Winter ticks were the main cause in 74% of all of the mortalities and 91% of winter calf mortalities. Winter ticks caused the health and productivity of surviving moose to be very poor and was the primary factor limiting the growth of the moose population in that area where the study took place. So this is huge impact. And the problem here is that part of what is causing this issue with the ticks is how dense the moose population has become.
Okay.
So that's allowing them to spread. So that's kind of the struggle. So I was looking at Maine's wildlife department website, and basically what they're saying is right now their populations are stable, but winter ticks are becoming such an issue that they believe the population will destabilize without intervention. So scientists are now basically trying to figure out how to maintain the appropriate density to have a sustainable moose population but not get this spread of winter ticks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you want to make sure you don't weed them out to be too thin so that they can't find
Correct.
each other and reproduce. But just like the white-tailed deer, where they cull in this area, like there is a healthy balance. Um, this also reminds me of something from the presentation from Dr.
Yeah.
Seth Moore. I'm telling you, man,
So
look him
sad
up.
I missed this.
Um, but one of the things that I thought that this, what you're talking about here, really highlights even more talking about the assumptions about why moose populations were declining in Minnesota were being made. Is it hunting? Are we over hunting them?
Hmm.
Is it because there's too many wolves and the wolves are taking them down? And this is where scientific study is so important because those were both like sort of positions that had political implications and like easy gut instincts on what you wanted to go for. And the answer was neither was the problem. They
Hmm.
both impacted populations, but at a sustainable rate. It was things like this where like no one would be like, I bet you it's all those ticks out there that
Right.
are multiplying. You don't know that unless you do studies. And so this is why it's so important to have biologists in the field looking at populations in different areas to seeing what's going on because like our assumptions are often wrong.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
this is
That's
wild.
yeah, it's a good point. And I think just like what you're saying, like I'm somebody, we've talked about it on the podcast before. I have really worked hard to kind of change my attitude towards hunting,
Yeah.
but it's hard sometimes because it's not ever something that I would enjoy doing,
Yeah.
like sport hunting in particular. I don't understand it. So I do feel like I would be a person who, where if I lived somewhere where the moose population was declining and moose
It'd be your
hunting
first
was
look.
still happening, I would be like, yeah, like, why are we still hunting? So it is important to really look and see what information is out there, and it's good to know that states are actively working and studying this because this is exactly what I found on the New Hampshire Fish and Game website. Like they had questions about it at like Q&A style, and because people were asking like, oh well, if this moose is a species of concern, why are we still having these moose hunts? And so they were talking about things like this. But another question that was on that website that I wanted to highlight too, mostly because of the answer that they gave, is, so we're talking about how terrible these ticks are. So there was the question, is there any way to kill the winter ticks that are affecting our moose? And the answer, go for it, New Hampshire Fish and Game says the best ways to reduce the impacts of winter ticks would be to add back the 3 weeks of winter we have lost due to climate change or reduce moose density. That was their answer. And I cackled. That was well played. Well played, New Hampshire Fish and
Ooh.
Game.
I have seen videos of biologists in helicopters shooting paintballs of tick repellent onto moose.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if that's effective, but that's some like they are trying all these avenues.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's once you destabilize these conditions, it's really hard to undo what you did.
Yeah. I laugh a little bit at that answer, but it is true. Like that's the reality. And that's why when we talk about wanting to slow the impacts of climate change, this is why these are the things that we're trying to avoid. And I do think it's nice to have specific examples of things like this when we say, so that we're not just saying, oh, like, oh, climate change is going to affect
Right.
animals in different ways. Here's a specific way. Here's a couple of specific ways that we're already seeing climate change impact our species. So, and they do go on to say after that reducing moose density is the other way to help here, and that they are continuing to study that. So they go, I'll just finish the rest of their answer. They say that said, we don't know, given the current weather parameters, what moose density may be most effective for balancing the reduction of tick impacts while maintaining a viable moose population, barring longer winters or fewer moose scenarios, there's no viable way to reduce ticks on the landscape. So that's what they're continuing to study is what is that density, what is that viable population that they need to keep. So, and that is what I think states all across where this is being impacted again, primarily going to be towards the southern end of the moose's range where they're feeling this the most right now. They're continuing to try to do more research on that.
I also think like one thing we just haven't mentioned is that indigenous populations have hunted moose for a really long
Mm-hmm.
time. And so if there are new moose for them either, like that disrupts cultural practices in
Yeah,
those areas. So there's always again that like commingling of humans and nature. It's the acceleration that climate change has caused that
yeah,
changes all those parameters.
absolutely. And that's kind of the all of that, everything that we just went over with the winter tick, that was not what I had originally intended to center the episode on, but I felt like needed to be once I started reading about it. I do want to, and kind of touching on where you just went, Casey, I do want to wrap up with the aspect that I originally made me want to talk about moose, which was that when I was talking about my trip to the Rocky Mountains, I discovered that moose
Are not
were
native.
apparently not native as such to that area. And so I do kind of want to close out with a little bit of that. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but I do just kind of want to go over it real quick. Colorado is a space where, at least in general, overall in the state, moose seem to be doing well. I think, again, depending on the area of the state that you're in, there may be some differences there. But again, historically, Colorado is a place where it seems like moose were maybe not historically found in large numbers. However, upon looking further into that, maybe even that's not quite so straightforward. So I'm going to have a couple of articles linked in the show notes that I really hope you check out. I'm going to have a million things linked in the show notes because I always do, but I'll try to call out especially these two, one article from the Smithsonian and one article from Sapiens, which is a digital anthropology magazine, but it seems to have, be well written and by folks who are in the field. They kind of have differing takes or different spins almost on this. And again, what I found from the National Park Service basically presents this sort of consensus that moose were maybe more transient to Colorado
Okay.
than necessarily had a big sustainable population there. So that was kind of what I was going into, and that is what the Smithsonian article puts forth as well, that moose were not necessarily permanent residents in Colorado. And they kind of tell the story of the initial transport of moose from other places in a pretty negative light, I would say. So, this is from the article. They say the Colorado Wildlife Department's 1976 proposal, in quotation marks, to introduce the half-ton animals is a mere 54 pages and includes no comprehensive studies of their potential ecological impacts. Gene Schoenfeld, a Colorado Wildlife Department biologist and moose hunter, said, "We brought them to Colorado because we could." He said, because we had the space and the habitat for them. So that's kind of how it's presented
Huh.
in this Smithsonian. It's doesn't seem to imply much thought or care was taken. And that's not always how it's presented. The Colorado Parks and Wildlife website has a pretty nice timeline outline of when moose were brought in from other places, and that goes all the way up into the 2000s that moose were being transported in. So I think that they would say that there was a little more work and evidence done around that. But also, the Sapiens article kind of argues even before that, not even thinking about specifically when moose were brought in, but just the idea that moose were not residents of Colorado before, they actually call that into question a little bit, which I thought was interesting. But they make the points that we're looking at written records of moose encounters, and not all encounters are going to get recorded. I kind of liked their quote. They said, in absolute terms, the number of moose mentions in early written records may be a better measure of the quantity of European settlers with a notebook than of the true number of resident moose.
That's yeah.
Kind of a fair point.
Yeah.
And then they do also want to make note of Native peoples' knowledge as well. There is a snippet in the Smithsonian article that mentions an indigenous person's encounter. I'm losing my place in there now, but who had supposedly never heard of a moose. And the Sapiens article makes the point that, well, maybe we shouldn't necessarily be trusting a white settler's interpretation of an indigenous person's knowledge, which I actually think is a fantastic and very important point as well. So
Yes.
the whole thing was just interesting, both kind of the two ways that the story was painted in these articles. And I'm not even saying I actually think that they largely agree on how moose should be handled from here on out, I think. But it's just interesting to see those different perspectives on how we came to be here and even some of the disagreements in what we quote unquote know to be true about the history of moose in Colorado. And it just is an interesting reminder that this is all very complicated.
Yeah. When we talked to Vaughn, who's a butterfly scientist that we
Hmm.
talked to, Dr. Shirey, he was talking about how he uses AI to help aggregate historical data records
Hmm.
on things like this. And it just proves like how difficult having to like set aside different like factors and how much you should weight a particular account or versus an
Yeah.
absence in a certain area because you're going to have to look at populations of people at the same time. So like, yeah, this is complicated.
Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing this up because I think it really dives into like some of our historical misunderstandings of animal populations in general and also our historical understandings of how settlers interacted with native peoples.
Yeah. It's super interesting, and I almost do wish that I had made this a whole separate episode, except I don't know that I would have had enough to,
Fair. Yeah.
necessarily build around. But I do hope you read both of those articles. And again, I'm not calling out either one of those articles as being wrong or bad. I think they're both well done and interesting to read about. But like I said, it is just a reminder of how complicated all of this is. I will say, coming back full circle to where we are today, now, regardless of how we got there, I don't like nobody, the Sapiens article did sort of imply that wildlife biologists would call moose in Colorado invasive. And I don't, that is not a thing that I've seen anywhere, either like specifically stated or in the way that moose are being managed. Um, Moose are a huge attraction in Colorado. Like I was like over the moon to see a moose, as terrified as I was beforehand. I was incredible. I feel so fortunate to have been able to see them. Um, they're a reason that people go there now, and I think everybody knows that. I don't think anybody is trying to say, well, they shouldn't be here now. I think now everybody's trying to figure out how to manage them, and they do have an impact on the environment. And so that's what they're working on in Rocky Mountain National Park. The moose that I saw was collared. So they do studies, they do GPS studies, aerial studies on their moose to kind of figure out what their impact on the environment is and how best to manage that. We mentioned how much these animals eat. Willow, in particular, makes up over 90% of a moose's diet in the summer, based on studies that have been done on that. And willow is an important resource for lots of animals in the park, especially it was talking about beavers using willow for food and dam building. And so willow is kind of essential for this beaver meadows with very specific sort of ecosystem, kind of a wetland habitat. And so there's concern that the moose eating too much of the willow is going to kind of destroy these really important habitats, which are biodiversity hotspots. So things like that are important to think about moving forward with managing moose in Colorado, and that's being done. That's what scientists are looking at and trying to research. So conservation is complicated. Nature's complicated. Our interactions with nature are complicated. how we learn about the history of animals is complicated. That's what I've got. Moose are amazing, but there's lots of tangled threads to kind of tease out with how we, I hate to use the word manage, but with how we manage moose populations from here on out.
Thank you for shining a light on one of my favorite animals because they're so interesting. And I think that that tangled web really is like one of the reasons I like them so much
Yeah.
is even though like I have this sort of like resonance with that sort of peaceful solitude that I envision my like fake magical moose
Hmm.
having out there, the challenges that they face are really like that emblem of what happens with climate change. Like,
Yeah.
I learned about climate change when I was like 13 years old, but it always felt like something that was going to happen when I was old.
Hmm.
And knowing that, like, we right now, as humans, scientists are doing this with animals, seeing the very real world impacts of how it's manifesting in ways that, like, no one necessarily would have straight on predicted this exact
Right.
scenario. It's just like unfurls in a lot of different ways. So our interactions with our environment in like both direct moose related ways and climate related ways, all one big circle.
Yeah. Do you have any? I feel like I went sort of maybe a little too much doom and gloom with this. Do you have any magical, fun moose fact that you want to wrap up with before we close out? I was really putting you on the spot. I'm
That
so
really was.
sorry.
I don't. I think I
That's
don't. I think
fair.
I think you covered a lot of the interesting parts about moose. But I just think like in the United States, we don't have a lot of megafauna that have that awe-inspiring thing. Like you think
Yeah.
about Africa and you can name like 20 different animals that would make you just be like, wow. We don't have a whole lot of them here in the US, and they tend to be like fairly sparsely populated and mostly concentrated at the West. So having something that's like kind of bridges a lot of different parts of the US up north, but going all
Yeah.
the way across, I just think that they're one of the few things in the US that we can like you would stand in front of this animal and be like, wow, this immense size of this
Yeah.
animal is like they can be up to 10 feet tall. We don't have giraffes, but we have moose, guys. That's so cool. So no fun fact, just mostly awe and inspiration on my
Yeah.
end.
That was great. Love it. Appreciate it. Stick around, everybody, and we will be right back to wrap it up. All right. Thanks once again for listening, everyone. Thanks, Casey, for your discussion. Before we close out, I do have to say it has been well established how much moose freak me out. I mentioned in, I don't remember if it was the deer one or the Rocky Mountain one, but whatever, that I did not know what to do if how like because I was saying you would think that because I was so afraid of moose that I would have researched what you're supposed to do if you
Yeah.
come in close contact, and I didn't. Well, I did, and I do not like the answer that I was given, which is basically run away and try to put something large between you and the moose. Casey, they can run 35 miles an
I
hour.
know. I know. I just thought of my moose. So when you're like trying to take moose data, the moose scientists have to either run at the moose as fast as they can and hope that the moose thinks not worth it and runs away and lets the baby like drop
Nope,
down like deer do, or they have to hightail and run the opposite direction. And
nope.
my fun fact about moose is that apparently baby moose imprint extremely quickly. So you don't want to separate a baby moose from its mom because you don't want to be its mom. So they have to blindfold baby moose when they do tests on them.
That pit in my stomach just came back.
Sorry. Sorry.
Oh my gosh. Um, yeah. So one of my challenges for the week, with that in mind, is just to treat wildlife with respect, y'all.
Yes.
Truly. I'm laughing about it, but truly. I thankfully had a lake in between me and the moose when I saw them. But I would not,
Ideal.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, they can swim, but I feel like I would have been
You
able
have a head
to
start.
get
Yeah.
away, yeah, fast enough. They have nose flaps too. There's a fun moose fact. They have
Oh,
nose flap. They can
very cool.
block their nostrils when they're swimming or eating their aquatic plants. Um, just distracted myself. Tree wildlife with respect. You don't want to get caught too close to a moose, as amazing as they would be. It's not amazing to have one out to get you. So I went up to the Smoky Mountains earlier in the year too, and we were fortunate to get to see bears pretty close up. But I do remember they were out, they had a ranger out there watching to make sure that everybody was being respectful. And I do remember they had a couple of folks were coming by on bikes and they had them, even though the bears were totally ignoring us, they were just perfectly content looking for their acorns or whatever they were doing, but they had the bikers stop and like use a car as a shield to go past where the bears were just in case, just to be safe. So
Yeah.
it is a good reminder, these animals are living their lives out there and they're trying to protect their homes and their babies and all of that. So just make sure if you do get lucky enough to see these animals in the wild to treat them with respect. And then, secondly, another challenge for you this week is to check out your own state wildlife, natural resources department, whatever it may be, to learn about what's going on with your local wildlife. I was actually really impressed with several of the state websites that I looked at with the amount of information they had about moose and specific things that they were doing, studies that they had done. So take a look for your area and see what's going on and if there's any way that you can get involved, whether that is something that you can do in your own area or just, again, like we talked about, using your voice to let people know what's important.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for this excellent episode. Where can the people find us if they want to share their challenges that they're completing for us?
You can find us on Facebook, A Little Greener Podcast, or you can send us an email at a little greener podcast at gmail.com. We're always happy to hear from you. Questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, whatever you'd like to share. We'd love to hear it.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.